All right, sir. All right. So 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. All right, folks, welcome back to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. I am very excited to have as my guest today, Dr. Timothy Shaw. Tim, welcome.
Thank you very much, Guy.
All right. So Dr. Shaw has undertaken original research into how laws of war and deeper considerations of ethics and justice can inform our understanding of moral injury, the signature wound of contemporary war. Timothy has taught ethics at the University of Sydney and holds a research master's investigating the implications of just war theory, the most uninterrupted, longest continuing study of moral decision-making known in the Western world on psychological distress arising from preparative agency. Tim holds a PhD investigating moral injury and the question of why killing is traumatic using the ethical optics of French philosopher Emmanuel Levinas. Tim, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Great to be here.
All right, man. Before we get started, share with our listeners where you're from originally and where you are currently, and then we'll dive in.
Originally and currently from Sydney.
Okay. All right. Done. Let's go.
Yeah.
Let's move on.
That was an easy one.
All right. So, Tim, this is, I was reading your bio and it's intense. How did you get into this field?
Look, I had a fabulous teacher when I was at university who really opened my mind to some of the very obvious when you look at them, but very unobvious when to the naked mind about some of the wartime changes in morality and ethics that soldiers must operate under. And and the more I looked into it, the more I felt it was an important thing to talk about.
But why? What's the interest in war? What's the interest in moral injury and trauma?
Okay. Well, from war is a fabulous petri dish for the ethics and morality of the societies in which those warriors come from, because depending on what causes you go and fight for, or how you kill enemy combatants, those value judgments are reflected in the societies in which your soldiers will come from and return. Moral injury is a very hot topic. It's the signature wound of contemporary warfare, and there's a clinical definition, but the field is crying out for a definition or a more robust definition, and that's what I've been spending a lot of time on, trying to define this term in a different way, and in doing so, it takes you down some very strange rabbit holes. I gotta say.
Okay, yeah. I want to ask you to define it, but first I want to get a clearer picture of what's drawn you to this topic. Are you a veteran yourself? Have you gone to war yourself?
I've not gone to war.
Okay.
There was a fabulous philosopher, Jan Patočka, and it said, look, those that are drawn to thinking about the cataclysm of the front line are, whether they're there or not, can start to see some really important truths of society and of humanity itself. And engaging with these sort of things as a citizen, I think it's maybe like dessert a little bit too much is a little bit too much, but I think it's a very, very, very nice thing to have in your meal.
Yeah. Well, I would certainly agree. All right, so let's define moral injury. You said there was a clinical definition out there, but what would you say?
Well,
how would you?
I mean, there is a lot of talk about PTSD, moral injury. So PTSD arose from 70s as a mechanism to understand wartime trauma from Vietnam veterans, and also, in fact, to understand trauma coming out of society from childhood sexual abuse. And in the stroke of a pen, they created a diagnostic PTSD, which classified in terms of symptom and not regard to cause. So PTSD is really just symptoms. And as the symptoms change through the DSM, different research trajectories and different groups and a wider section of groups use it to understand trauma, because trauma becomes a normal reaction to an abnormal stressor, apart from being an abnormal reaction to an abnormal stressor, which makes it very difficult to talk about in society if it's an abnormal reaction.
Mm-hmm.
Moral injury, however, which is I believe is a totally different kettle of fish, because while you can take away the cause from PTSD, moral injury is based on values and an irreconcilability of some form of values. Very difficult to take them out of the situation or the person. Or I mean, some values are great values in certain situations, not so good in others.
Now, moral injury, correct me if I'm wrong, is commonly, at least for the lay person, commonly associated, or more commonly associated with war than other types of traumatic incidents.
Sure. I believe, though, it's spreading. I think there's a bit of bracket creep, just like PTSD.
Right.
Moral injury, it certainly is a war description. And I've got some reasons for why that is the case, but I believe that we have a general, I mean, you could walk down the street and be morally injured for very day-to-day things that we sort of brush under our psychological carpet, so to speak, which becomes a little bit harder when the issues become a little bit more poignant.
Mm-hmm. So moral injury, if I'm hearing you correctly, a fracturing of our belief systems, our values.
I've got a good example. I've been thinking about an example for you for the show, and a personal one. So I used to do a lot of swimming, and around this time, in fact, it's very early here in Sydney, I was driving to swimming training, and I went deserted roads. There was a red light, and I thought, Jesus Christ, I might just, it's not a big thing. Anyway, sirens, and I get think, you can't do this. And you know what? I didn't feel bad about it. You know, if I was going through the red light and there was a pigeon that normally flies away and I hit it, I might not feel bad about it. If there was an injured animal that I could have, that I should have like, well, maybe I feel bad about it. If it's a human, well, we're getting higher and higher into some very deep understandings of the value of human life and as such. And these sort of things can become very twisted in war, because you've got innocence in wartime is operationalized to a threat posed. So you can be morally innocent, but as soon as you put a uniform or carry a rifle, you're now a legitimate target. Or, for example, there's a thing called the moral equality of combatants doctrine, which means that each combatant on each side of war has the same moral equality assigned to them, independent of their cause. So this is not the same in society.
So how are individuals, and obviously this is going to be different depending on the individual, but in what ways, and what are some of the ways that people experience moral injury? I mean, what does that mean to be morally injured with veterans coming back? Or
well, I mean, there is like pardon me, I should also put a disclaimer. I am, with the greatest respect to psychologists, I'm not a psychologist. I've spent a lot of time thinking about these things, but it manifests differently in different people. However, the question of what it actually is, or how can you describe it, or is it particular to a particular time or a culture, are interesting questions, which I think can then, if they're explicated, can go to solving some of these deep-seated soul-searching concerns.
Okay, we'll go. So let's answer one of those.
Okay. So, all right. There is, in 1880, there's a little bit of history involved in this explanation. In 1880, there was a philosopher called Frederick Nature, and he said the history of Europe for the next 200 years will be understood as a society that's secularizing away from belief in God. We have a scientific method which has come paradoxically from a very strange will to truth in the Christian faith, which is from this father confessional nexus. So this will to truth drives a scientific way of thinking, which then decreases the amount of space that you have for myth and values. For example, the planets used to have some values associated with them, and now they're, scientifically correct. We understand why they fly around. There's no deeper, there is no, superficially, there's no deeper meaning for why, why the moon rotates around the Earth. It's not, there's a gravitational force.
Right.
So he said this. He goes, look, as society secularizes, we are going to think about it. We're going to say, well, look, we like our values, I guess, Judeo-Christian values. Now, we had at World War II, it was the greatest generation that fought in World War II. They were the most religious generation, the oldest living generation. They were the most religious. They were credited with building middle-class America, had very strong views, almost absolute, of what's right and what's wrong. And I had a little bit of a look about what was happening in World War II, because in the end, those structures are with us today. Those moral structures, as well as the institutional structures that we have, and particularly we have some legal structures which I believe have changed the way in which we should think about moral injury. Which are, I'll keep going,
yeah.
Okay, at the end of World War II, we decided to do something totally different, because it wasn't the civilized versus the barbarians. It was civilized people versus civilized people. Very, very confronting for culture and belief. And I mean, what could go wrong? So where are these values? How do we understand values in society if this is the most civilized state in Europe can go AWOL, right? So the newly established War Crimes Commission that was looking at the murder of the Jewish population, because in the places where the Jewish population was murdered, and that's how they were going to understand what is now termed the Holocaust. Instead of doing that, Nuremberg was set up, and Nuremberg was for non-localizable crimes, and they had to invent them. So they invented the crime of genocide in Nuremberg, and that's the first usage of genocide. And because genocide didn't even encapsulate, for example, anti-Semitism or anti-anyism, for example, because it's a meta-ethical anti, they broadened out genocide to crimes against humanity. And in so doing, crimes against humanity where once it was possible to kill without any trouble to your conscience of someone that didn't believe the same thing that you believed in, maybe a religious or a different meaning, now we have instilled in our societies that the human lives beneath these views, and there's an inviolability to a human. Now, what does that have to do with moral injury? Well, when you've got such a very colored or very, I'll put it this way. In 1937, I believe it was, Hitler said, who after all is talking about the Armenians? And I think it was only last week that the whole world was talking about the Armenians, because they entered into a very special club, the Genocide Club, and these crimes became so universal and so broad that they could be applied to events that occurred before even the existence of the crime. They're saying that they're so basic, these ideas that we've brought into existence from Nuremberg, they're so basic that we can now reapply them through history. And in that way, we're changing the moral landscape of the Western culture.
And this is impacting veterans, soldiers, not just soldiers today.
Yeah, of course. So imagine going, look, if you're, we all live in a post-crimes against humanity world, and it's only getting stronger. So like there's a lot of, to be asked to go and, take in society, have a very strong conception of humanity, or that, there's instead of a responsibility now, there's an obligation to a human. And it's very easy sometimes you can breach responsibilities in certain circumstances, but it's very difficult for your mind to breach an obligation. Mm-hmm. And these sort of things the field really hasn't taken into account these sort of broader picture moral genealogies, because if they did, moral injury occurs throughout various periods, and in fact all periods. However, I'd argue that it's quite particular per period, and the fact that we have now labelled moral injury as a term, it really is the very backstop psychological term that you can have in psychology, because it really buttresses up against belief, and you can't get any further. In its heart, it really isn't a scientific nomenclature. It's more of a broader philosophical or a belief or some a lot deeper and very difficult to codify. Mm-hmm. However, it does, because it didn't just spring up, right? We just haven't just decided, it hasn't arrived by accident. So what are the conditions in which it has arrived and come on to our shared understandings?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I appreciate what you're saying. In a sense, it almost feels like, or I guess it begs the question, are we able to address it? Are we able to deal with it? Are we even able to treat it?
Oh, yeah, sure. Yeah, well, treating it is very difficult, because a lot of the crutch, the social or belief crutches that you use for treatment are the very things that have snapped. And instead of, and this is what happened. So this is what, I guess, a lot of this, I make a parallel to World War II, because the morally defying, comprehension-defying moral atrocities that we really don't know how to think about, right? Now, it shook belief and religion to its very core. In fact, it was almost like a reformation. People were saying, well, hang on a second, this thing called theodicy, which is belief, that suffering is justified for the human with an all-knowing, all-loving God, and we're happy to suffer because this and that. They said, hang on a second, we're not happy to suffer this much. This is out of control. And it shook religion, because it couldn't explain the immensity of the human suffering. And that's in a smaller paradigm, I believe, what happens with individuals as well.
Do you feel that is your interest specifically with wartime or moral injury?
I don't think you can really separate it. My interest is in really understanding the conditions of which have led to the term, what the term means. We introduced the term PTSD, and that was, once you introduce a term into existence, it gives it's like observing a particle. The observation of that particle changes it.
Mm-hmm.
So those sort of considerations in a broader section, broader piece are, I think, very important to try and nut out. And then through nutting those out, we should, I'd imagine, be in a way better position to start to treat, understand, and respond to moral injury.
Mm-hmm. Do you feel that we're in a position to accept? I mean, my feeling is that there are some people have a hard time even acknowledging trauma, right? Because you can't, in a sense, see it. It's not a, one's arm hasn't been blown off. And moral injury to me even seems almost even more invisible. Is there a sense of disbelief in the existence of moral injury?
Well, look, there might be, but that would only be because, I'd imagine, of the extreme of possible apathy in a society. And if you can't recognize, if you're asked to go and kill someone that hasn't wronged you personally, and you feel bad about it, or you feel morally injured, it'd be a big person to say you can't feel like that. Like you can't say that. Like it's such a, because it's going against a lot of deeply embedded belief structures, social structures, and to say that it's invisible. Look, I mean, it's moral injury it's like looking at something through an electron microscope, because the deeper you go, the less you find. And, there's nothing there anyway. You look at an atom and you'll find that there's nothing there anyway, but it's still very meaningful.
I did my dissertation on existential impacts of combat trauma. And my dissertation included interviewing people who'd come back from trauma and who'd experienced people who come back from combat and experience trauma and PTSD. Everyone I talked to, Tim, told me that they'd experienced just what you're talking about. This sense of being their earth, their universe, their belief systems, their morality was shattered. How could this have happened to me? How could God, however those individuals define their God, how could this been allowed to happen? And as a result of that, their whole framework, their whole world existence was shattered. And it was really incredible to hear.
Oh, it's so poignant. Meaning is drained out of an existence. And I feel as if while PTSD is a symptom-based terminology, moral injury it's an injury to humanity. It's an injury to one's humanity, to one's idea of moral folding in your moral blanket and having no creases. And as soon as you start getting all these creases, I mean, you may as well start sleep on the couch, because it's just like, I guess as well that you can really, with moral injury, and because it's really an injury of humanity, of values, of meaning, the meaning of your values, or how your values are understood in society, it becomes a very holistic, it becomes a larger project to think about. And I think I believe that moral injury will become a very, very much more widely used and appreciated. I wouldn't even call it a diagnosis, really, but just more of an understanding surrounding this is on the way.
I think what is so kind of interesting and at the same time um, depressing is when you're talking about this within the context of combat, right?
Mm,
You're talking about soldiers, individuals who've gone into this theater in a sense
yeah.
with the training to inflict a certain amount of harm to someone. So they're being trained to do something for
Mm,
which a lot of them experience this moral trauma, right? And that in and of itself, how can you
mm.
ask me to go in and do something and then this is happening to me?
Well, exactly right. I mean, I'm possibly counterintuitive, but the more moral security a society has, the less moral security a soldier has,
Mm,
because yeah, there's no, there's no meeting of these two ideas at all. In fact, it's a breaking of them.
that's very interesting. The more moral security a society has, the less a soldier has, in a sense.
Yes.
How does this play out for people who have experienced other types of trauma? Who haven't gone to combat in a sense.
Well, look, I've, I, it's, I'm not too sure. I believe it could be. I mean, combat is the really big one. Moral deliberations or moral inexactitudes between or a clash of values that happens all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And pardon me, and and as I but these sort of things in society, we've got a very easy way of not dealing with them or having them dealt with for us, because we have a rule of law. And just like the police person that will pull you up for going through a traffic light, you you will get some laws that cannot be divorced from the spirit of the law. And like a lot of, what's this? If you sort of, for example, break a law, or there's like maybe not law, or if you do something in the spirit of something without, and it can look totally different from the thing itself, it's a way in which we cope with, in a way, with these sort of clashes, which are coming towards us at a very fast rate in this society. It was the American Prometheus, as he's now as he's known, Mr. Oppenheimer. He was very good at explaining this clash. He said, "Look, as society, as we become more, science goes in one direction. Even if it's a failed experiment, it's still a null hypothesis that has been proven. There is no such constituent moral thinking. It's not linear. It doesn't keep progressing. And as such, they're just they're not the same way. They're not different ways of thinking about the same thing. They're totally different ways of thinking. And as we have more of an emphasis on these, quest for knowledge and facts and how things work, then it doesn't necessarily come with a corresponding moral component until a roadmap to tell you what to do about it.
I know you said you weren't a therapist, but as far as your understanding goes, where do you see treatment going in terms of moral injury? Where do you see it being successful? What's on your radar?
Um, I'm talking about having a language and a way of talking about it. It's very, moral injury can be even unexplainable. Like, it's very difficult sometimes to even put words to understanding what's going on in a nihilistic state, or when values start to crumble. It's very difficult to understand how to even conceptualize that. I imagine in the clinical setting, there is a lot of work to be done with maybe explicating some of the base ideas about values, or understanding that there could be different, well, for example, for crimes against humanity, which is an idea about humanity that is not understandable, that cannot be, political expediency cannot alter. Can you think about, like, so how can we think about a way to understand crimes against humanity vis-a-vis through human experience, and instead of, without going towards, well, a religious text or a doctrine like this, which might have been broken by, for that person. And if, arguably you can, and the French philosopher Emmanuel Levinas arguably provides one, by finding a compassionate a interhuman compassionate keystone, which doesn't rely upon a benevolent father figure in the sky, which is a fabulous tool to help people who have now sort of have a crisis of these sort of values that are surrounding these big ideas.
Mm-hmm. All right, Tim, I obviously we're just scratching the tip of the iceberg with this conversation. But as we kind of wind down here, can you share a go-to book recommendation, whether the subject is moral injury or not? What would you have?
Oh, look, I like to find, there's a Fine Balance is fabulous, by Rowan Misery, I believe.
A Fine Balance, okay.
A Fine Balance. That's a fabulous book about, I imagine, moral injury. Just and Unjust Wars is fabulous. I've got it right here. Michael Walzer, he's a contemporary just war theorist, I'd imagine you'd say, in the current era. And okay. That's about it. Yeah.
Okay. I'll include those up at the show notes page here at the traumatherapistpodcast.com. But let me ask you, before you go, a lot of therapists are listening to this. What would you say it would be important for them to remember in terms of this topic of moral injury?
I'd say it's important to remember the background, and a lot of things we might they sort of see them, or we take for granted. I mean, it's very difficult to see outside of our idea of society in that society. Mm-hmm. And in a way, look, I see moral injury as almost an epoch-defining term for Western culture. What other culture has decided to make a term for moral injury? It's crazy. I guess it goes to some very deep, and go into them later another time, some very deep anomalies or some justifications, which are now have been pushed to such a very small point through this will to truth and through knowledge that they're really it's really a very high pressure area, I'd imagine.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, look, I want to thank you for taking the time. I realize it's early there where you are.
It's a pleasure.
Well, I appreciate that. This topic, again, I just feel, and it's clear, I think we just scratched the surface, but I really want to thank you for taking the time to be here, Tim.
Thank you, Guy. Cheers.
All right, so we'll be in touch.
Cheers. Bye-bye.